Hakone was frustrating. As a location, it's the quick getaway from Tokyo, a day trip spent hiking or a few nights enjoying the onsens and art scene which the mountain prefecture is known for. But the main event, a gondola up the smoldering volcano and a cruise over Lake Ashi, is really fucking boring. Let me explain. Firstly, I caught the Shinkansen or the bullet train from Shibuya to Odawara, and over the course of my entire trip I would have caught over a dozen of these, but since this was my first one, there was a lot of novelty and excitement in doing this, and yeah, it goes pretty quick. At Odawara, I picked up the Hakone Free Pass, which gets you free train rides, bus rides, and museum discounts. Then there was a more slow and rustic train line connecting to Hakone. At this point, we'll switch to using this beauty of a map used on the JR website, because despite looking like it was whipped up on MS Paint in 2003, it does a really good job of distinguishing the stations throughout Hakone. And because nothing is ever simple, you need to understand that Hakone is actually a catch-all name for the various villages and stations surrounding Mount Hakone. Hakone Yumato is the largest of all the villages. It has the most restaurants, hostels, and cafes. Walking out from the station, you can grab this photo, which is literally every Google search return for Hakone Station, so that's nice. It was the middle of summer and the middle of a heat wave, so about 40 degrees Celsius. So of course I thought it was a fantastic idea to walk the 2 kilometers uphill to my first hostel. Turns out there's a bus which goes by every half hour. I just didn't know. My first night was spent at K's House, a prolific hostel chain. It had a very chill vibe, there were onsens downstairs, and almost everybody I met was nice. However, I went to bed early when an American dude with a shark-toothed necklace grabbed a guitar and started playing Green Day's Time of My Life. Still, I recommend it. The next morning, I woke up early and caught the train to Gora. The train ride is actually pretty fun. The train itself is quite old school, so it needs to continually reverse and zigzag up the mountain. Anyway, it's about a 30-minute ride which takes you to the end of the first major line, and I got out here to drop my bag off at my new guest house. Now, up until this point, you need to understand that I'm loving Hakone. I've left the big city, I'm breathing fresh mountain air, and the warm sun is beating down. And I'm excited because I thought that what I was about to do, the Lake Ashi Circuit, was meant to be a rad hiking trip. Well, my first tip-off should have been all the old people hobbling around. Anyway, I spent half an hour looking for a grocer to buy some sushi and onigiri to keep me going on the hike because I thought it was going to be that exerting. But there was no need for such drastic measures. I was never more than 10 minutes away from a cafe or a vending machine. So, you start with the Hosen cable car, which lumbers up the mountain until you can move onto the ropeway. The ropeway gives you a stunning panoramic view of the valley. It crests the smoking caldera and mountaintop, which was probably a perfect metaphor for when my excitement was actually peaking. You step out onto the lookout where you'll find a geology museum, a viewing platform for Mount Fuji, and your choice of either a supermarket or a grocery store in case you got hungry in the 15 minutes between here and leaving Gora. So naturally, I walked over to the viewing platform, but of course it was overcast and I couldn't see anything of Mount Fuji. Fantastic. Also, I learned you weren't allowed to hike down the mountain to the lake. Brilliant. So I had to get back on the ropeway and be carried the rest of the way down to the lake. Now, the lake is beautiful and there's great photo opportunities with boat sailing away and docking every 20 minutes, but there was nothing to fucking do. Of course, there were more cafes and somebody was walking a dog and I asked to pat it and they said no, and I had nothing to do except hop into the next queue and wait for the boat. And I feel like I'm running on repeat because yes, it's very beautiful, and on the boat ride the landscape is like a Norwegian fjord and lends itself to great photography, but I spent majority of the circuit standing in crowded lines waiting for the next mode of transport to carry me onto the next vehicle. Obviously this was my fault for not researching further. It's entirely my fault, but at this point all I could think of was the South Park ziplining skit.
Alright, let's hear you say zipline!
Zipline.
Shaka, bro! Woohoo! Alright, nice zip!
Well, how was it, Cartman? Totally fucking stupid, dude. Oh, really?
But that's not entirely fair. It didn't entirely suck, especially when I hopped off the boat at Moto Hakone. I grabbed some lunch and tried to collect myself. And I'm glad I did, because Moto Hakone was a highlight. Afterwards, I found a bus to take me to the Hakone Open Air Museum. Genuinely, this is one of my most favorite art museums I've ever visited. Entry costs less than a few dollars, and then you descend down a long, foreboding escalator and exit through a tunnel into an outdoor museum. It was awesome, and then my phone ran out of battery. Yep, after hours of recording cramped sky rails and train carriages and queues, my trusty iPhone 8 expired. I feel like an idiot scrolling through Google Images, but you need to understand just how good the exhibit is. It's a mix of classical and modern art, and even features a lot of original Picasso works. Especially if you've never been to an open-air museum, there's something special about being outdoors and engaging with the art and culture. But by this point, I was in desperate need of a shower. So I bought a bento box from 7-Eleven and headed to my accommodation in Gora, just 2 train stops away, completing my circuit of Lake Ashi. My accommodation here was the Hakone Gaku guest house. It definitely isn't a traditional hostel experience, which is what I normally go for, but it was really cute and I'm glad I chose to stay there. It was run by 2 Japanese dudes who were just hanging around, drinking beer. A few different groups of families were staying as well, including a large Chinese family, and I stayed up late watching the Soccer World Cup with their grandmother. The only English words she knew were "good tackle," and that was all we needed. I also had one of those very brief, intense friendships with another backpacker, Josh, who was living and working in Japan as a teacher. We clicked instantly and exhausted ourselves bonding and talking about politics, video games, morality, what he had observed of Japanese culture, and funnily enough, our autoimmune conditions. He was a very cool dude, and it was an affirmation of why I traveled, since I love the temporal moments of intense connection, and it was a pick-me-up I definitely needed at this point in the trip. And not only were we 2 medically deplorable boys, but he also has a YouTube channel where he plays video games and talks about his travels or something like that. As you can see, he's kicking off his YouTube career, so I expect big things from him in the future. Anyway, that night we slept on our futons and went our separate ways the next day. And yeah, that's my brief experience in Hakone. I definitely hope to go back in future and try to spend more time focusing on other hiking opportunities and the onsen culture, but definitely by that point I was happy to move on. Especially because the next leg of my trip was one of the highlights of my entire trip, where I headed into rural Japan and hiked through the Kizo Valley in the sweet, sweet Japanese heatwave. I'll see you there.